Before we start, let us know where you're watching from, subscribe, hit the like button, and stick around till the end. Here we go. Eleanor paused at the creaky gate leading into a small park with thick lime trees. The evening sun still pierced through the canopies, painting soft flecks of light on the ground. She was tired after a day's work and longed for peace and quiet. But barely had she taken a step toward the old bench when she saw something strange. A girl of about 10 was walking an enormous cat on a leash. It looked most like a lynx or some exotic beast, because tufts of fur were visible on its ears. "What a beauty!" Eleanor whispered, forgetting that she usually didn't talk to unfamiliar children. The girl proudly lifted her chin. "He's not just any cat. He's a Maine Coon," she said with such conviction, as if referring to some royal title. Eleanor felt a strange tremor. Something in the animal's posture, or in its watchful gaze, unpleasantly reminded her of past experiences. Memory struck like a hammer on an anvil, and for a second she lost touch with reality. Flashes from the past flickered before her eyes: the dampness of a forest, crushing hands, faded wallpaper, in an unknown room. "Yes, a very rare breed," the girl added, and, adjusting the ribbon on the cat, moved on. They disappeared around the bend of the path, and Eleanor remained standing, clutching the handle of her leather handbag. The bag felt heavy, but what had risen from the depths of her memory was far heavier. She wanted to sit on the bench, but a sudden breeze snatched golden leaves from the branches, making her feel even more melancholic. "No, I can't stay here," she decided, and hurried toward the park exit. Her heart pounded. It was as if someone or something had reminded her of an old secret, an event she had tried to forget for a long time. She had once seen similar tufts on ears. Only that animal had very different intentions. "It's all over. I'm not in that forest anymore. I'm completely different now," she reassured herself. But fragments of memory instantly surfaced: a wild gaze and the pungent smell of a mysterious brew. "It's all over," Eleanor repeated to herself, and decided she would definitely tell her husband about her unease, or maybe not. Perhaps it wasn't worth stirring up the past unnecessarily. With these thoughts, she left the park gates and walked along the quiet street, trying to get home as quickly as possible. Eleanor was born and raised in the town of Pine Ridge to a family of young entrepreneurs, Helen and Max Holloway. They were dynamic individuals who dedicated their lives to securing their daughter's future. But, alas, life sometimes ends at the most unexpected moment. When Eleanor turned 7, her parents left on a business trip to the neighboring town of White River. They promised they'd be back in 2 days and would bring a gift, a puppy Eleanor had long dreamed of. But she never saw the puppy nor her parents. There had been a car accident. Mommy, Daddy. Little Eleanor initially didn't understand the meaning of the words, "won't be back." She thought everyone was just trying to scare her, and that her parents would walk through the door any moment. But reality proved merciless. Eleanor had no close relatives, and if it hadn't been for Mrs. Davies, who had been their nanny, the girl would surely have been placed in an orphanage. However, the woman, despite all difficulties, risked taking guardianship. "Aren't you worried? That's a huge responsibility," acquaintances asked. But Mrs. Davies just shook her head. "I can't do otherwise. The child is all alone." And so Eleanor gained a second mother. Mrs. Davies wasn't wealthy and didn't have a lavish home, but she had a big, kind heart. She worked in the school library and in the evenings earned extra money typing ads and texts on an old computer. "If you need me, just call," Mrs. Davies would say when Eleanor cried at night. "Mommy and Daddy went to heaven, but their love stays with you." With years, the pain began to subside, yet memories of her parents continued to burn Eleanor's soul like hot coals. She wanted to live up to their memory, and when she graduated from high school with honors, she decided to attend the Architecture Institute, the very one Helen and Max had once graduated from. "Are you sure that's where you want to go?" Mrs. Davies asked cautiously. "Yes, I am," Eleanor replied, a determined glint in her blue eyes. "I feel like I can continue their legacy there." Now she was 18 and felt grown up, a beautiful, statuesque young woman with a braid reaching below her waist. That's what her friends called her. She tried not to waste time on idle pleasures. Her main goal was her studies, and she eagerly absorbed knowledge, striving to meet both her own expectations and those of her heavenly parents. The architecture department greeted Eleanor with the smell of fresh plaster and dusty rolls of drafting paper. In the admissions office, a stern professor flipped through her documents for a long time. "Math Olympiad awards, drafting certificates. We don't often get applicants like you." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I'll do my best to excel." And she did. From her freshman year, she became one of the leading students. Her sketches, models, and calculations surprised even experienced educators. "Well done, Eleanor," joked her friend Pauline, who was in a parallel department. "If you keep this up, you'll be a famous architect by 30. Eleanor just smiled in response, but in her heart she knew it wasn't just her ambition, it was her mission. She lived by the principle of, "I mustn't let my parents' memory down." "Aren't you overdoing it?" grumbled Greg, a classmate who wanted to get closer to Eleanor. "You could have some fun, go to a club." She just shrugged. "Is a nightclub the place to find inspiration?" Greg didn't know what to say and awkwardly changed the subject. However, Eleanor wasn't alone in her drive for high achievements. Victor, another talented student, often tried to discuss books on architectural history with her, or invite her to a museum. But she, though she sometimes agreed, still seemed inaccessible and reserved, perpetually engrossed in her own plans. Among these young people was Leo, a handsome young man with bright red hair and an equally bright ego. He was enrolled in a different department, but often appeared in the architecture corridors, explaining that this was where the most interesting projects and most beautiful girls were. "But you're special, Eleanor," he once said, handing her a bouquet of incredibly expensive roses. "Thanks," she replied curtly, clearly uncomfortable. Rumors that Leo was the son of a prominent public official circulated throughout the institute. They said his father held a high position in the city council, and the family owned a mansion in a prestigious neighborhood. At parties, Leo was confident, easily spending large sums on entertainment, never thinking about the cost. Eleanor wasn't inclined to judge people by their wallet, but his desperate assertiveness made her uneasy. It seemed he wanted to conquer her, like a prize. "Stop it. I'm not an object," she'd say if he too persistently tried to treat her to something or give her a ride home. But Leo just laughed. "I'll definitely get my way. How can anyone resist genuine adoration?" Eleanor would turn away, avoiding answers. She liked his intellect and his ability to speak beautifully, but there was a hint of malice in him, a hidden aggression. Mrs. Davies learning that a golden boy was courting her, sighed, "Be careful, dear, that this doesn't turn into sorrow. Wealth sometimes corrupts people." Eleanor then just brushed it off, not attaching much importance to her adoptive mother's words. Time passed. Leo did not give up. Sometimes he'd leave expensive chocolates on her desk in the classroom. Other times he'd buy theater tickets and almost drag her along. Then he'd suddenly show up at the dorm, where Pauline lived and Eleanor often visited, and honk loudly. "Eleanor, come out, I'll take you home." Sometimes it was even pleasant, but more often it was annoying. She felt he had no boundaries, no understanding that her studies or personal space might be important to her. "Leo, stop," she'd repeat. "I'm uncomfortable. Don't you see how I feel about you?" He'd try to play on romantic feelings. "I see, but," Eleanor would falter, "I'm just not ready for a serious relationship." "Serious?" He'd smirk. "Of course serious. I'm even willing to marry you if necessary." Eleanor once cautiously explained to her friend Pauline, "I don't think he's sincere. When he talks about marriage, there's a strange mockery in his eyes." Pauline would nod, but then put on her favorite music, distracting herself from heavy thoughts. However, Leo didn't just continue to pressure Eleanor. He also tried to undermine anyone who got close to her. When Victor was once walking with Eleanor, Leo threw a remark at him. "Hey, buddy, don't even think about messing with my plans." "What plans?" Victor asked, surprised. "Leave us alone. I already warned you." Eleanor noticed Victor's face went pale, and the next day he stopped seeking her out. "Why are you avoiding me?" she asked. "I don't want any trouble," he replied evasively, "and it's better if I just don't get involved in your business." Eleanor felt cornered. It was as if Leo was slowly pushing away all potential friends and admirers. "He's like a spider weaving a web around me." An unsettling thought flashed through her mind. Even Mrs. Davies once noticed an unfamiliar, expensive car parked near their building. "Maybe it's your suitor?" she asked, looking out the window. "Probably," Eleanor quietly replied with a sigh. This was all starting to feel like an obsessive pursuit, but Eleanor tried to stay focused. Studies, preparing for exams, her term project. She thought that if she just ignored Leo, he'd find another target. Midway through her sophomore year arrived. Eleanor had new responsibilities in her life. She volunteered at a youth center, helping high school students prepare for drafting competitions. One day, as she was giving a lecture to the children, Leo quietly entered the room. He waited for Eleanor to finish, and, ignoring the curious glances, said, "Elena, I'm sorry to interrupt. I need to talk to you." She discreetly stepped out into the hallway. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice down. "I know you don't want a romantic relationship," he began carefully, "but I'm willing to do anything to make you mine. Leo, we've already talked. Marry me." He exhaled it as an undeniable truth. Eleanor gasped. Everything inside her seemed to turn cold. She didn't love him, and Leo himself looked as if he felt not affection, but a desire to possess. But the memory of her childhood, of her lost family, of how fragile life was, instilled in her a fear of loneliness. "Why are you so insistent?" she asked. "I want a beautiful, intelligent wife by my side," Leo said with a hint of mockery, "so everyone can see that I hold a treasure." She felt a sickening dread, but Leo pressed on as usual. "Let's go to my parents' place on Saturday. They want to meet you. They're waiting for us at their country house." "All right," Eleanor agreed, though deep down something screamed danger. If he's introducing me to his parents, maybe he really is serious, she thought. However, she also set a condition. Remember, no intimacy until after the wedding. As you wish, princess, he smiled in reply. Just come, and we'll discuss everything. Saturday was gray and bleak. It had been drizzling since morning, and by the time Leo picked Eleanor up, the clouds were only growing thicker. "What a gloomy sky," Eleanor said as she got into the car. "Don't mind it," Leo waved off. "It'll clear up soon." He drove fast, with the slight arrogance of someone who believes they have everything under control. He only occasionally glanced at her, as if checking if she had changed her mind. On the way, they talked about trivial things, the weather, their studies. Eleanor tried to calm her trembling. She had no firm conviction that everything would go well. The community of Azure Creek greeted them with tall pines and opulent mansions nestled along a picturesque forest edge. The house they arrived at turned out to be a 2-story estate with large windows and wrought iron gates. "Are your parents here already?" Eleanor asked as Leo opened the door. "Almost. They'll be here soon," he replied evasively. Inside, it was spacious. The rooms were furnished with expensive classic-style furniture. Crystal vases and silver figurines stood everywhere. A strange silence surrounded them. No sound, no movement. "Where is everyone?" Eleanor felt uncomfortable. "They'll be here by evening. For now, we can relax," Leo said, inviting her into the spacious living room. An open bottle of wine already sat on the coffee table. Eleanor didn't like alcohol, but for politeness' sake, she agreed to 1 glass. "To meeting your parents." She took the glass, feeling her heart pound in her throat. The rest happened quickly and frighteningly. The bitter taste of wine, a slight tremor, a fog in her eyes. Leo's voice became distant, his movements sluggish. She tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't obey. "Leo, what are you?" she whispered. "Shh, shh," he replied, taking her arm. "It's all right. You're just overtired." Then came fragments of consciousness, unfamiliar hands tearing at her clothes, touches that aroused disgust, helplessness. The last thing she remembered was being dragged somewhere, and outside it was damp, dark, the wind howling through the pines. When Eleanor woke up, it felt as if centuries had passed. Her head ached as if someone were hammering inside. She lay on a narrow wooden bed under a rough blanket. The smell of herbs hit her nose. Opening her eyes, she saw a ceiling of dark beams and the faint glow of an old lamp. She turned her head. Next to her on the floor sat a large animal, painfully resembling a bobcat. Pointed ears with tufts, spotted fur, yellow eyes, staring with such intensity as if the creature was studying her. "Where am I?" she whispered softly, not expecting an answer. But then the creaky door burst open, and a plump, elderly woman in a headscarf appeared. In her hands was a mug from which steam rose. Finally awake. "Now then, Nora, let me pass." She gently nudged the animal with her foot. It reluctantly moved away. "Drink, child, it's a brew. It'll help clear your head." Eleanor wanted to refuse, but she felt an inexplicable sense of peace in the hostess's tone. She sensed that the very atmosphere of the room was imbued with care. "Who are you?" she asked, accepting the mug with trembling hands. "I'm Ms. Hazel, and I've lived here a long time. People call me a herbalist, a healer, whatever they like. And this beauty," she nodded towards the bobcat, "is Nora." Eleanor tried to recall the events of the past day, but her memory flickered in pieces. Pulled back hair, cars, a glass of wine, Leo's aggressive hands. "What happened to me?" she whispered, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. Hazel sighed, sat on the edge of the bed, and covered Eleanor's hand with her warm palm. "My dear, Nora pulled you out of the forest, found you twisted up, bound hand and foot, barely breathing. I don't know who did this to you. You can tell me when your strength returns." Eleanor covered her face with her hands. She was ashamed, hurt, and terrified. She cursed herself for trusting Leo. "You lie there and heal for now." Hazel pointed at the mug. "I've put all the most healing things into this brew. You'll recover faster." The bitter taste of herbs burned her tongue, but gradually warmth spread through her body. Eleanor rested her head on the pillow. Nora the bobcat approached her, staring intently, and as if sensing something, pressed her soft side against the bed, purring softly. Days passed. Under Ms. Hazel's gentle care, Eleanor began to recover. The physical wounds, bruises, scratches, a dislocated arm, healed, but the emotional wounds ached like fresh burns. "Leo assaulted me," Eleanor confessed one evening, clutching a mug of hot herbal tea. "I barely remember anything, but I'm sure it was him." "I thought so," Hazel nodded sadly. "Did you want to report him to the police?" Eleanor lowered her eyes. No, I can't. He's from an influential family. No one will believe me. Besides, it's pointless." A stern determination flashed in Hazel's eyes, but she didn't press the girl. She simply stroked her arm. "All right. If you don't want to, then don't. Everyone has their own path. Stay with me for now. You can help around the house, and I'll feed you, heal you." Eleanor nodded gratefully. In the evening, lying in bed, she repeatedly heard Nora scratching at the window. The bobcat seemed to be guarding the house, and this gave her a sense of security. During these weeks, she got to know Hazel's life intimately. A modest cabin on the edge of the forest, where mobile phone reception was unreliable. A pot of herbal concoctions, smelling of dried mushrooms and wild herbs, always simmered on the stone hearth. In the morning, Hazel would leave to gather plantain and St. John's wort flowers, and upon returning, she would make poultices and salves. "Here you have nature and healing," she would say cheerfully, trying to distract Eleanor a little from her gloomy thoughts. However, nightmares continued to haunt Eleanor in her sleep. She dreamed of running through a dark forest, with Leo following, a crazy smirk on his face, throwing shards of glass at her back. One night, Eleanor woke up screaming. Hazel was sitting next to her, fanning her with a small branch that looked like lavender, and Nora stood guard at the threshold. "Hush, child, it's all over now." But was it all over? Leo remained free and, perhaps, felt no remorse. "How can I live now? I can't spend my whole life in this house. But it's terrifying to go back to the city. What will I say at the Institute? And what will Mrs. Davis think?" One evening, mustering her courage, she asked Hazel for the phone and called her adoptive mother. Mrs. Davis's voice trembled with emotion. "Eleanor, are you all right? Where are you? I was about to file a missing person report." "I'm sorry I didn't call sooner," she replied, feeling her heart clench with guilt and fear. "I'll be back soon. I just need time. I got sick." "What happened? I'll come," the woman exclaimed. "No, don't. I'm safe. Mom, please believe me. As soon as I recover, I'll return." Mrs. Davis's voice held anxiety, but she agreed. "All right, but don't disappear. At least call." Ending the call, Eleanor pressed the phone to her chest, unable to hold back tears. 2 weeks later, when her physical wounds had almost healed and the emotional pain had receded, into a dull ache, Eleanor decided to leave Hazel's home. "Thank you for everything," she said, hugging the old woman's sturdy frame. "No need for thanks, child," Hazel chuckled. "Just remember that you now have a second home if ever you need it." Eleanor nodded and turned to Nora. The bobcat sat calmly at her mistress's feet, and for a moment the girl saw an almost human sadness in its gaze, as if the animal understood they were saying goodbye forever. "Goodbye, Nora," Eleanor whispered. The bobcat gently rubbed against her knee, letting out something like a purr, and then stepped back. The journey back to Pine Ridge took several hours. Eleanor felt lost and afraid of what awaited her in the city. After all, the Institute, her friends, and Leo were still there. Her first stop was Mrs. Davies' house. She dropped everything and rushed to her. "Eleanor, oh my goodness, I'm so glad. How much you've been through. Tell me everything." But Eleanor spoke very sparingly. "Something terrible happened, but I don't want to go into detail. I'm alive, and that's what matters." Mrs. Davies was wise enough not to torment her adoptive daughter with questions. She simply hugged her, gave her herbal tea, and allowed her to cry it all out. "Mom, I don't want to study at that institute anymore," Eleanor said, barely composed. "I'll transfer to a different university for distance learning." "Are you sure? You dreamed so much?" Eleanor shook her head. "I've already made my decision." The following weeks were busy. Eleanor looked for a job, replaced her documents, and transferred to her new university. She deliberately avoided talking about Leo, and no one knew exactly what had happened between them. People at the Institute wondered why such a promising student had suddenly disappeared, but Eleanor didn't want to explain anything. Soon, Eleanor found work as an assistant architect at a small design firm. She was only 20, but with her talent and persistence, she quickly adapted. Every day, walking to work, she tried to think about the future, not the past. However, rumors about Leo sometimes reached her. From former classmates, she learned that he was still living extravagantly, attending the wildest parties, and no one dared to cross him. "Has he completely lost his mind?" Pauline exclaimed one day, calling Eleanor. "They say he has tons of connections now, not just with girls, but in the criminal underworld, too." Eleanor felt a bitter taste in her mouth. This man continued to live as if nothing had happened. "I'm lucky I at least survived," she thought. She had almost come to terms with the idea that justice in this world was unattainable. Let fate take its revenge if it wishes, she convinced herself. And fate, it seemed, truly intervened. One evening, as Eleanor was finishing work, her phone unexpectedly rang in her bag. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number, but for some reason she felt it might be important. "Hello?" she answered. "Eleanor, it's Hazel," a familiar, slightly husky voice said. "Miss Hazel," she breathed out in astonishment. "Did something happen?" "Well, you could say that. Nora sent her regards." Eleanor felt a flutter inside. Hearing about the bobcat was unexpectedly pleasant and unsettling. "And what about Nora?" she asked. "Nora's fine. She's always running through the woods. But that scoundrel who tormented you crossed her path today." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. "Leo? How do you know?" Hazel snorted. "He apparently brought some girl to our neck of the woods, wanted to do to her what he did to you. But Nora wouldn't stand for it. She gave him hell, so the doctors will have to patch him up thoroughly." Eleanor bit her lip, not knowing what to say. On one hand, she felt relief that Leo had finally gotten what he deserved. On the other, she was too scared to even imagine the details. Is he alive?" she asked. "I believe so. But doctors say whether he'll ever be able to eye up girls again is a big question, a very big one." Hazel's voice held cold satisfaction. "I decided to tell you so you'd know. Everyone gets what they deserve," the herbalist concluded. "Now you can live in peace." The call ended there, but in Eleanor's mind it was as if the sky had cleared after a storm. Nora, the protector? A thought flashed through her mind. No one could ever prove that the bobcat had specifically attacked Leo, but for Eleanor and Hazel it was all too clear. It was karmic retribution. After that call, something shifted in Eleanor's soul. The heavy burden of guilt and shame began to lift, giving way to a sense of peace. She still wished no one ill, but the fact that Leo had learned a lesson became clear. Soon after, she learned from acquaintances that Leo was in critical condition in the hospital, and his father was trying to sweep the matter under the rug to avoid unwanted questions. They said he had supposedly been injured by some wild animal. Well, let him answer for his actions now, Eleanor thought. She focused on her work, took on more projects, sometimes traveling to sites in other cities. Mrs. Davies saw her adoptive daughter blossoming, regaining her former confidence. "My dear, do you finally feel a weight lifted from your heart?" she asked gently one day. Eleanor smiled and squeezed her hand. "I think I've learned to let go of the past." At night, lying in her room, Eleanor recalled the chilling images of recent months. She remembered how Nora had looked at her with that special gaze in Hazel's cabin. If it weren't for Nora, she thought, if it weren't for Hazel. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief. Several more years passed. Eleanor was now married to a man who loved her sincerely and tenderly. His name was David. He was also an architect, and supported her in all her endeavors. They had a daughter, little Sarah, who resembled her grandmother Helen. And on this sunny day, as Eleanor walked home from work through the park, her heart sang with happiness and gratitude. Passing the familiar path, she suddenly saw a girl with an enormous fluffy cat, which reminded her of that past encounter. Only this time she felt no horror or pain, rather a faint nostalgia. "Beautiful cat," she called out, and the girl smiled back cheerfully. Memory brought before her the image of Nora the bobcat and kind Miss Hazel. For a moment she imagined what this massive domestic Maine Coon might look like next to the wild predator. A funny thought flashed. Nora would surely show him who's boss. Eleanor sighed, looking up at the sky. The day was quiet, bright. The wind barely stirred the leaves of the trees. The past that had once tormented her soul was now just a part of history, left behind. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and walked out through the park gates. Somewhere behind her, the silhouette of the girl and her cat remained, and ahead awaited a home filled with warmth, children, and love. Everyone gets what they deserve, Eleanor thought, and perhaps there is a higher power in this world that comes to help when it's needed most. With this thought, she walked along the quiet street, smiling, for she knew. Now she had everything she had ever dreamed of, and the past could not steal her happiness. Thank you for watching. What do you think of this story? Share your thoughts. Your comments are very valuable to us.